Okay. Ay, all right, here we go. So to begin today, let's talk about culture's impact on impact on personality. Before we do this, I want to highlight some important concepts and research findings. Uh, Before we highlight, let me start over. The two individuals that the individuals who study a lot about culture and personality as Matsumoto and Yang. Um, uh, and they really are the kind of the gurus, as you would say. I don't know if that's the right term, um, but that study the differences in personality based on cultural influences. Okay. And we've kind of gone through these, but I want to give them kind of some conceptual ideas. Speaking of theories like Freud's and others. So let's start with the role of culture. When the role of culture is brought in, the more the theoretical controversies become more pronounced. Okay. And we've kind of talked about some of these controversies, such as the Western kind of bend to understanding personality. And we find that there may not be some cross-cultural, cross-culture validation for a lot of theories that we have. In fact, underscoring the need for cross-cultural perspectives in psychology, we've talked about the five factors theory. The most well-known attempt at pulling together research on personality does not formally address the role of culture. So when we look at even these well-developed and consistent research findings, such as those with the five factors or five trait theory, Big Five is the other way that it's known as, it really doesn't really address the issues surrounding culture. And this is some of the issues that is still currently trying to be addressed within the field of personality theory, personality psychology. And just to kind of remind everybody about the Big Five, remember it spells out ocean, um, neuroticism, depression, a tendency to experience dysphoric effects, sadness, helplessness, and guilt. Extroversion is also related to gregariousness, a preference for companionship and social stimulation. Um, Openness to experience, action, and need for variety and novelty and change. Agreeableness, also known as compliance, a willingness to defer to others during interpersonal conflicts. And then conscientiousness, this is also called achievement striving, a strong sense of purpose and high aspirations. So we got to look at these in this kind of way. We also need to look at and give some framework when we're doing cross-cultural theoretical ideas about what theories are. And if we look at, for example, Freudian theory, it's all about conflict and conflict models, conflicting things between aggression and sex or developmental stages, as you would say. Um, Fulfillment models, such as the humanistic approach, is becoming the fullest person we have. And then cognitive models is seeking consistency between our behaviors, our emotions, and our belief systems. Okay. So when we think of these kind of broad theoretical approaches to personality, um, we can see that, for example, in Freud's intrapsychic model, even at the pure theoretical level, as you will see, the role which culture plays varies according to the model. Okay. So, for example, conflict model, culture plays an inhibitory or repressive role. Okay. And this can be seen in Culture Against Man, and really, Freud wrote a paper on the conflict between society and the individual. Okay. And in this, what he argues is that societies and culture, the legal system, laws, government, were all developed to inhibit or repress our sexual and aggressive drives. That the purpose of society, the purpose of culture is to make it so individuals don't act out on their needs and desires in order to keep a well-maintained society. Okay. So in this model, again, it's that culture inhibits us from doing what we would naturally do if we were just if we were just feral, I guess is the best way to put it, in this model. Okay. Humanistic or the fulfillment model or existential model, culture provides various channels for self-realization. So, as Meltz whiskey, I think that's how it's pronounced. He said, every type of civilization, every custom, material, object, idea, and belief fulfills some vital function, has some task to accomplish, represents an indispensable part within a working whole. Okay. So for a fulfillment model like the humanistic approach and whatnot, is that culture provides various outlets for us to discover who we are as an individual. So our education system is meant to expose us to a broad array of information and tasks. Our work environment, the way we interact with our environment, all provides us culturally with kind of who we are. And when we think about this, we do have to kind of step back and go, yeah, but societies and cultures can also inhibit. Okay. And probably one good example of this is the history that is told in elementary schools and high schools that give a very Western spin on American history. And we've all kind of experienced this. And so, while in a lot of ways, culture can uh, provide us with a avenue for self-discovery, it also can inhibit us from really feeling our fulfilled self. And so this is something that's not added on to this slide, which I think is very interesting when we look at it. Hence, according to the fulfillment model, culture is not against man, but rather culture allows various human needs to be met and goals attained in this kind of way. Consistency model, or what we call cognitive models, the role of culture is to reduce anxiety. Culture-based routines enable predictable patterns of behavior, which could turn anxiety low. Culture provides structure and meaning in our lives. So again, in the cognitive model, what we're looking for is consistency between our behaviors, our emotions, and our attitudes and beliefs. And what this would argue from a cultural lens is that culture provides a framework to make it so our world is consistent and is predictable, which are two really important human needs that we have. We talked a little bit about the concept of self, okay? And our sense of self is core to our being, and consciously and unconsciously influence every thought and action and feeling we have, okay? The self makes sense within an individual culture, okay? So for example, in individualistic cultures, the self is seen as internal attributes, including needs, abilities, motives, and rights, okay? But different cultures produce different self-concepts, as we will see here in just a minute. So our self-concept, for example, within individualistic cultures like Western culture, especially here in the United States and Great Britain, uh, our self is this internal thing. It's what makes us who we are. Okay. Um, And this brings up the notion of what's called independent or interdependent selves. Okay. An independent control of the self is to maintain independence of the individual as separate, self-contained entities. Okay. This comes mostly in more individualistic cultures. Individuals focus on personal internal attributes, individual abilities, intelligence, personality traits, goals, preferences, expressing them in public, and confirming them in private. So if you tend to think of yourself as a separate entity that is unique and has your own abilities and whatnot, you have what's called an independent control of the self. Okay. An interdependent control of self, which is mostly you mostly see in more collective type of societies, is to fit in and maintain the interdependence among individuals. Okay. In this control, the self is unbounded, flexible, and contingent on context. The most salient self is defined in its relationships between individuals, not contained within the self. Okay. So having an interdependent control means that you walk into a situation. If you take the big five, you're more agreeable, you're more open to experience because who you are is dependent on the situation in which you find yourself. Um, and so it's a different type of mindset than an independent control. And this is kind of how it would graphically, if we looked at it from a graphical perspective, you'll see that in an independent control, the self is completely separate from mothers, friends, coworkers, siblings, and fathers. And there's no overlap between the two, between the self and others, I should say more clearly. In an interdependent situation, though, yes, we do have components of who we are, our skills, our abilities, all of those things, but there's overlap. Okay. There's parts of myself that are also parts of my father or my sibling or my coworker. We're not completely independent from each other. We have connections that keep us bound to each other. Okay. And so this is one other way to kind of think about independent versus interdependent or interdependent self-controls. Okay. And then this gets into things like self perception or consequences of having these two controls. Several studies have supported the notion with an independent self, internal attributes are most salient and less salient for interdependent selves. Okay. In one study, this was done in 83, subjects wrote down as many of their own characteristics. One response type was abstract, another response type was situation specific for individuals. Okay. So in when we have internal attributions, we tend to think of them in the abstraction. Whereas when we have an interdependent construal, we tend to have more specific responses based on the situation that we find ourselves in. And continuing with this, findings confirm that Americans with independent self-concepts report more abstract types, whereas Asians with interdependent selves view report more situation-specific, concrete self ideas. Okay. Interdependent selves find it difficult to describe themselves in abstract internal attributes, such as I am sociable. Okay. And so, in a lot of ways, if you think about, for example, why Asian Americans tend to have a difficult time acculturating into the American system or the American culture is because in the American culture, we use more abstract ideas to describe who we are. And that can be a very difficult transition for someone who is acculturating after they immigrated here from somewhere like Asia, because they want very concrete attributes, not abstract ideas. So what does it mean to be sociable is something that they're looking for, not just this self-description that I'm a sociable person like we would describe ourselves here in the United States. Social explanations, self-construals serve as cognitive templates for interpreting behaviors of others as well. So those with independent selves assume other people are the same as them. And this brings up that error that we talked about earlier. Fundamental attribution error is the bias to explain another's behaviors in terms of your own control of self, not necessarily theirs. So what you would have done in that situation is the basis for our reasoning why another person would do something or not. Okay. It's almost kind of putting your values on someone else's behavior to try and explain it. When we look at these consequences and continue on, Miller in 84 examined the patterns of social explanations in American and Hindu Indians. Okay. Both were asked to describe someone they knew well who did something good for another person and who did something bad and explain why. Americans tended to describe behaviors in terms of general dispositions, okay, meaning that they're a good person or a bad person. They're likable, unlikable, they're social, non-social, dispositional traits. Whereas Hindus tended to provide explanations in terms of the actor's duties and social roles, meaning what was their position within that behavior, okay? What was the actor supposed to do when they're in that role? In other words, it was a very situational, specific factors instead of dispositional qualities of the individuals. When we look at things like achievement motivation or the need for achievement reverse to the desires for excellence, we can see that independent controls excellence is linked to individual's tendency to push him or herself ahead and see individual success, motivated by individual achievement. And we see that cultures that have more of an interdependent control, excellence is sought to achieve broad social goals, motivated by collective or group achievement. So you kind of can see these trends between different types of culturals and the way they see it and they see the world. in Western cultures where the individual is emphasized. It's about the individual and what motivates that individual. When we get outside of the Western kind of notion of interdependence and success is a community event. Excellence is sought through social goals and group achievement, what rather than individual achievement. Uh, Young in 82 distinguished between individually oriented and socially oriented achievement motives, okay? Uh, Such as related to filial piety or duties and obligation to family members, especially parents. And Bond in 86 found that Chinese show higher levels of social oriented motivation, meaning more respect and duty to the family and to the community that they're in. Self-enhancement, defined as a collection of psychological processes by which individuals reinforce or enhance our self-esteem. In the U.S., again, another cultural difference is people tend to exhibit a self-serving bias, meaning we tend to attribute good deeds and successes to our own internal attributions, but bad deeds to deeds or failures to external factors. So I was successful. I I did really good on the test because I studied hard. I'm a good student. I failed the test because the professor made the test too difficult. That information wasn't covered in the class. And so we make more external attributes for failures. And this is kind of the what's called the self-serving bias in order to help us maintain a sense of self-esteem and that we're a good individual. Okay. In the US, people also use false uniqueness effects. Okay. This is considering themselves to be more intelligent and more attractive than average. Okay. When we measure things like, do you think you're attractive, unattractive, or intelligent, or there is this kind of false uniqueness effect that people tend to rate themselves as more attractive than other people who are like me, more intelligent than other people who are like me. And so, um, anyway, so that's another kind of attribute that Americans have, or at least US here in the United States. These controls are not prevalent outside the US. This is the interesting part. This false uniqueness effect and the self-serving bias, we tend not to see these same kind of biases that when we go study other cultures. For example, Japanese students claim that 50% of other students would be better than them and attributed success to good luck and failure to insufficient ability. Okay. So they don't make that internal versus external attribution to success and failure. And they recognize that statistically, there's going to be 50% of people less attractive than you and 50% more attractive. That in the idea of everyone is just kind of average looking. That makes it statistically possible. Okay. And so we see these. And again, what I would be encouraging you to do is looking at your culture because we know this can vary. These are overall comparisons. Where would you be on this, and where do you think your culture, your unique culture that you come from, would place you on these different scales? We also have social connotations of emotions, positive and negative. Okay. Socially disengaged emotions tend to separate and disengage the self from social relationships and promote perceived independence of the self from those relationships. Socially engaged emotions further engage and assimilate the self in the relationship and enhance a perceived interdependence of the self relevant to others. Okay. So we have a set of behaviors that disengage us from social relationships to maintain a level of independence, but we also have emotions that engage us into relationships and enhance interdependence between the self and relevant others. Okay. And this is where we can look at things like social connotations and indigenous emotions, okay, or what we call cultural specific emotions. There's been some anthropological studies that suggest that some socially engaged emotions are virtually absent in Western culture, okay? Um, and this is kind of an interesting thing is so what they found studying some indigenous cultures is that in essence Western cultures have lost some emotions, lost some ability to experience socially engaged emotions with other people because it seems to be absent within Western culture. Okay. And so uh, this brings us back to that independent versus interdependent way of going. In some cultures, such as these indigenous ones that were studied, they tend to have a longer list of emotional expressions than what we have here in our Western culture. Okay. So, for example, a study in Micronesia cultures found one emotion central to culture. And it's kind of these two terms. I'm not going to play like I can pronounce them. FAGO is a combination of compassion, love, and sadness. Um, KER is a combination of happiness and excitement, perceived as dangerous and socially disruptive type of an emotion. So in these Micronesia cultures, they have combinations of emotions that we tend to, in our Western culture, separate and make unique of themselves. So in the United States, you wouldn't usually not hear the term love and sadness in the same term. But within these cultures, they tend to have this idea that yes, you can love someone and it can make you sad at the same time, which makes you then engage in a social behavior to kind of reduce this emotion. And again, I'm just going to spell it out of FAGO. Um, and so we this is an example of how in a lot of Western cultures we've lost certain abilities to feel a certain way that keeps our social fabrics tied together closer. Happiness, most generic, unqualified state of feeling or good, relaxed, elated, and calm. People experience this feeling when they have successfully accomplished the cultural task involved in either being independent or interdependent. So, for example, here in Western cultures, we tend to celebrate graduations. We tend to celebrate unique accomplishments and those types of things, job promotions, all of those types of events that bring us about the idea of happiness. Whereas more in interdependent cultures, they tend to recognize success of the family or the community. They don't necessarily focus completely on the individual. Um, I always liken this to my wife's cultures, being she's Mexican American, as I think I mentioned in here before, and they have more of an interdependent perspective in Latin America than we have here in the United States. And It's interesting to me that a 2-year-old birthday isn't necessarily about the little guy turning two or little girl turning two. It's about an event that we're going to get together and we're going to celebrate and we're going to have fun and whatnot. Whereas if you look at more Western-based birthdays, the complete focus is on the child turning 2 years of age. It's about that person, that child, and the celebration is centered around the child. Whereas if you look at more Latin American type of birthdays, it's centered around the family and the community that has got together to celebrate this communal event. Okay. 93, again, asking Japanese and American undergraduates to report how often they experience different emotions. Okay. For American students, generic positive emotions were associated with social disengagement, like pride. Okay. Whereas for Japanese students, generic positive emotions were associated with socially engaged emotions, such as feelings of respect. So when American, to kind of simplify this a little bit, American students or here in the United States, positive emotions were uh, associated with individual qualities such as pride. But when we're prideful, that it disengages us socially. Okay. Whereas in more collective cultures, such as Japanese students, the generic positive emotions were associated with socially engaged emotions, meaning they tended to feel happier when they had feelings of respect for others and those types of communal events. Okay. Another study in 95 studied European Americans and African Americans concept of self and school persistence. Okay. And the findings supported multiple concepts of the self. Okay. And this came to known as the cultural reaffirmation by cultural individuals identify more closely with their native culture. Okay. What basically the study showed is that when you're biracial or biculture, you tend to relate more, identify closer to that native culture that you come from. So Japanese Americans even tend to be more collective, like Japanese nationals. When we look at the European American or African American, we found that African Americans tended to uh, conceive of themselves more from their African traditions than their American conditions. Okay. And so bicultural uh, ways of thinking also determine who we are. And again, I can talk in the guys, my wife again is Mexican American. She's actually a native of Mexico. She comes from the Mayo tribe. And she does very much look at things through the lens of her indigenous and her Mexican roots, um, uh, which tend to be more collective in nature, which is kind of an interesting experience. All right. So I went through that, I think, very quickly. Let me stop sharing. Stop our YouTube.